How could a 3-year-old girl suffer fatal injuries while under the care of those meant to protect her? It's a question that chills us to the bone, isn't it? We entrust our children to those closest to us, expecting love, safety, unwavering care. But what happens when that trust is brutally betrayed? What happens when the very hands meant to nurture become instruments of unimaginable pain? This isn't a tale of monsters lurking in shadows, but something far more unsettling. This is a story about a mother, a TikTok personality, a woman known to thousands online, and the devastating fate of her young daughter, Juel. A fate marked by broken bones, a ruptured liver, and a torrent of unanswered questions. Prepare yourself, because the truth behind Juel's short life and tragic end is as heartbreaking as it is infuriating. This is the story of Asia Rosia and the daughter she was sworn to protect, but ultimately failed in the most horrific way imaginable. Welcome to Crime Stories Network. I thank you, my viewers, for your support as we keep bringing true crime stories against children, abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Please don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Juel Howard. Picture her, 3 years old, living in sunny Sarasota, Florida. She wasn't just any 3-year-old. She had this spark, this energy that just drew people in. Imagine her in a room, maybe scattered toys around, and her right in the middle of it all, completely absorbed in her own little world. Dolls were her thing. Not just pretty dolls on a shelf, but dolls that were part of her adventures. Tea parties with imaginary guests, dramatic rescues, quiet bedtime stories whispered to plastic faces. She'd spend hours like that, completely content, her imagination just running wild. And the sound of her laughter, it wasn't just a giggle. It was full-bodied, unrestrained. The kind of laugh that made you smile even if you didn't know why she was laughing. It was pure joy, bubbling up and spilling out. People who knew Juel, they remember that laugh. They remember how it could brighten even a cloudy day. She was a hugger too, always ready to wrap her little arms around you, a genuine, innocent affection that just melted your heart. And at the center of all of this, her anchor, her world, was her mother, Asia Rosia. Asia was doing her best. Life had thrown her some curveballs, no doubt. Things hadn't always gone her way. But looking at Juel, you knew Asia's focus was clear. Everything she did, every decision she made, was for her daughter. She wanted to break free from the struggles, to build something solid for them both. A stable home, a loving environment, a future where Juel could thrive. That was Asia's driving force. She was working hard, juggling responsibilities, pushing forward with that single-minded goal, Juel's happiness. Then, Jumar Edwards entered the picture. Asia and Jumar became a couple, and soon he moved in. It seemed like things were progressing, a family unit taking shape. Maybe to friends, to family, to anyone glancing in from the outside, it looked like things were falling into place. A mother, a child, a partner, a new beginning perhaps. But behind the smiles, beneath the surface of this new family dynamic, something was terribly wrong. Something was happening in that home, in the very place where Juel was supposed to be cherished and protected. That was anything but safe. Unseen, unheard by the outside world, a nightmare was taking root, one that would steal Juel's laughter, silence her bright spirit, and leave behind a trail of devastation and unanswered questions. Jumar Edwards. He wasn't a blank slate when he walked into Asia and Juel's lives. His past wasn't just a little cloudy. It was marked by serious concerns. For starters, there was his criminal record. It wasn't just a minor offense. It involved drug charges, suggesting a pattern of behavior that put him on the wrong side of the law. This alone should have raised eyebrows, but there was more, something even more disturbing. Accusations of domestic violence had followed Jumar for some time. These weren't just rumors whispered in passing. There were accounts, reports, stories suggesting a real problem with anger and control in his relationships. People who knew him, or knew of him, spoke of a volatile temper, a tendency towards aggression when things didn't go his way. It painted a picture of a man capable of causing harm, especially to those closest to him. Now, how did this man become part of Juel's life? Asia, Juel's mother, was likely looking for stability, for partnership. Raising a child alone is incredibly hard, and maybe Jumar presented himself as someone who could share that burden, offer support, build a family. Perhaps she wasn't fully aware of the depth of his troubled history. Maybe she saw only what she wanted to see, hoping for the best, overlooking the very clear warning signs. Or perhaps, weighed down by her own challenges, she felt she had limited choices. Whatever the reason, the reality is this. Jumar Edwards, a man with a documented history of drug offenses and a disturbing pattern of alleged domestic violence, became a live-in partner to Asia and a stepfather figure to little Juel. The red flags were there, stark and undeniable. They weren't subtle hints, they were flashing alarms. And yet, somehow, they were either missed, ignored, or underestimated. And in that Sarasota home, with Jumar now in a position of trust and authority, a dangerous path was being forged, leading directly towards unimaginable heartbreak. The shift in the household was becoming undeniable. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but more like a slow leak, draining the joy and peace from their lives. Arguments between Asia and Jumar were no longer rare disagreements. They were becoming a regular feature of the home. The tension was building, thick and uncomfortable, changing the very atmosphere of the house. Imagine the shift, from a place of relative calm to one where you could feel the unease hanging in the air, a sense of walking on eggshells. And in the middle of this was Juel. Children are incredibly perceptive, aren't they? They pick up on the unspoken anxieties, the undercurrents of emotion. Juel, who had been such a vibrant, happy little girl, started to change. Those around her noticed it. Her bright laughter, once so spontaneous and frequent, became less common. She seemed quieter, more reserved, perhaps seeking more comfort from her mother, becoming a little less outgoing, a little more hesitant. It's possible there were even subtle physical signs, a slight limp that came and went, a small wince when she reached for a toy, a bruise that appeared without explanation. These are the kinds of things that, in retrospect, can be seen as clear indicators, but in the moment, especially when you're hoping for the best, can be easily dismissed or rationalized. Then came April 11th, 2013. On the surface, it was just another day. Asia had errands to run, the everyday tasks of life. She needed to leave the house, and like any parent, she had to make arrangements for her child's care. She left Juel with Jumar. It was during the day. At home. Seemingly a normal situation. But this day was anything but normal. This day was the point of no return. While Asia was out, a friend decided to drop by for a visit. It was a casual, unplanned stop. But when the friend saw Juel, she immediately sensed something was deeply wrong. It wasn't just a child being fussy or having a tantrum. Juel was in distress. Visibly so. The friend could see it in her face, her body language, a clear indication that Juel was experiencing significant discomfort, possibly pain. And yet, despite this obvious distress, despite the friend's growing concern, Medical attention wasn't sought right away. Time passed. Crucial, irreplaceable time. Time in which Juel was suffering, her small body enduring injuries that were rapidly becoming catastrophic. The reasons for this delay, the conversations that occurred, the decisions that were made or not made in those critical moments, these remain deeply troubling and unanswered aspects of this tragic story. They speak to a critical failure to act when a child was clearly in need of urgent help. The true horror of what happened to Juel lay hidden, concealed beneath her clothes, invisible to a casual glance. There were no dramatic bleeding wounds to immediately signal the extent of the damage she had endured. But inside her small body, a battlefield of trauma was unfolding. Imagine the force required to inflict such damage on a child so young. The autopsy revealed the grim reality. Juel's liver was crushed, ruptured beyond repair. Her ribs, the delicate cage meant to protect her vital organs, were fractured, splintered. These weren't minor bumps or bruises. These were injuries that spoke of significant, brutal force. Internal bleeding, organ damage, a cascade of trauma that was silently, relentlessly shutting down her tiny body. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? That such devastation could be happening inside, while on the outside, there might have been no immediately obvious signs to a passerby. It was the visiting friend, the one who saw past the surface, who sensed the profound wrongness of the situation, who became the crucial link in the chain of events. Something in her reaction to Juel's distress, a deep-seated instinct perhaps, told her this was not just a minor ailment. This was an emergency. This was a child in serious danger. She didn't hesitate. Ignoring any potential awkwardness or fear of overreacting, she took decisive action. She called for help. 911. Her voice, probably trembling with urgency and fear, reached the emergency dispatchers. An ambulance was dispatched, sirens screaming, racing towards the Sarasota address. Time was of the essence, every second critical. Paramedics, trained to handle the most urgent medical crises, arrived ready to intervene, to stabilize, to save. But when they reached Juel, when they began their assessment, a wave of grim realization washed over them. They were too late. The injuries were too extensive, too severe. Despite their training, despite their equipment, despite their desperate efforts, there was nothing they could do to bring Juel back. The life of 3-year-old Juel Howard, so recently vibrant, so full of potential, had been brutally, tragically extinguished. The medical professionals, witnesses to countless scenes of trauma, were now faced with the heartbreaking reality of a life lost, a child failed, a tragedy that should have been prevented. The arrival of law enforcement marked a shift in the atmosphere. The quiet Sarasota home, now a crime scene. Police officers, detectives, forensic teams, they descended, their presence a stark signal that this was no longer just a medical emergency, but something far more serious. The investigation began immediately. Asia and Jumar were interviewed separately, their accounts meticulously recorded. What did they say? What stories did they tell? Initially, there was denial, a deflection of responsibility. Perhaps they presented a picture of a normal day gone tragically wrong, an accident, an unforeseen medical crisis. Maybe they downplayed any signs of distress, minimized any potential red flags. It's common in such cases, isn't it, for those involved to try and control the narrative, to steer the investigation away from uncomfortable truths. The investigators faced a significant hurdle. Unlike cases with obvious external wounds, Juel's injuries were hidden. To the untrained eye, she might have just seemed unwell, not brutally injured. This lack of immediate visual evidence made the initial stages of the investigation more complex. It relied heavily on careful questioning, on piecing together fragmented accounts, and on the subtle inconsistencies that might emerge in those accounts. Asia and Jumar, in their initial interviews, likely presented a united front, perhaps minimizing their arguments, downplaying any tensions in the household, and certainly vehemently denying any intentional harm to Juel. It was a delicate dance of investigation, trying to sift through potential deception, to find the cracks in the carefully constructed stories, to uncover the truth hidden beneath layers of denial. But the autopsy. The autopsy was the voice of truth in this case. It spoke volumes where words might have been carefully chosen to mislead. The medical examiner's findings were stark, irrefutable, and utterly damning. The report detailed the extent of Juel's internal injuries with clinical precision, painting a horrifying picture of trauma. A crushed liver, multiple broken ribs. The severity of these injuries wasn't consistent with a simple fall or a minor accident. The medical examiner stated, unequivocally, that the trauma Juel endured was comparable to what you might see in a high-speed car crash, a devastating impact. This wasn't accidental. This was violence. Forceful, intentional violence inflicted upon a defenseless child. The autopsy findings ripped through the carefully constructed denials, shattering any pretense of innocence. They provided the undeniable scientific evidence that a terrible crime had been committed. And the focus of the investigation, inevitably, turned towards those who were last responsible for Juel's care. The courtroom became the next stage in Juel's tragic story. The trial was set to determine responsibility, to seek justice for a life so brutally cut short. The prosecution laid out their case, piece by piece, building a narrative of neglect and abuse. They argued that both Asia and Jumar had failed in their duty to protect Juel. The prosecution emphasized the timeline of events leading up to April 11th, highlighting the growing tensions in the household and the subtle changes in Juel's behavior that should have served as warning signs. They presented the autopsy findings as irrefutable evidence of violent trauma that could not be explained by accident. Their argument was clear. Juel was a victim of abuse, and those responsible needed to be held accountable. The defense, on the other hand, attempted to create reasonable doubt. For Asia, the defense likely painted a picture of a struggling mother, perhaps overwhelmed, perhaps in denial, but not intentionally harmful. They might have argued that she was unaware of the extent of Jumar's actions, that she was also a victim in a way, manipulated or controlled. For Jumar, the defense likely took a different approach, perhaps claiming unawareness of Juel's injuries, suggesting they were accidental, or even deflecting blame entirely. It was a trial filled with legal maneuvering, with lawyers dissecting every detail, every statement, searching for loopholes, for ways to minimize culpability. The courtroom became a battleground of narratives, the prosecution striving to reveal the truth of Juel's suffering, the defense attempting to obscure it, or at least to lessen the legal consequences for their clients. The verdict arrived, and then sentencing. For Asia Rosier, the judge handed down a sentence of 10 years in prison. 10 years for failing to protect her daughter, for allowing her to be in harm's way, for not seeking help when Juel was clearly in distress. 10 years that felt both like a significant punishment, and yet utterly inadequate in the face of Juel's irreversible loss. When the sentence was read, Asia reportedly collapsed. Imagine the weight of that moment, the realization of the consequences, the finality of it all crashing down. A mother, already grieving the loss of her child, now facing years of imprisonment, years to contemplate her role in this tragedy. For Jumar Edwards, the sentence was harsher. 15 years. 15 years for the direct harm inflicted upon Juel. for the violence that ended her life. A longer sentence reflecting, perhaps, the court's view of his direct culpability in Juel's death. But even these sentences, years measured in double digits, felt insufficient to truly account for the loss of a 3-year-old girl, a life stolen, a future denied. Justice, in these cases, often feels incomplete, a legal resolution that can never fully mend the profound heartbreak left behind. The ripples of Juel's death spread far beyond the courtroom, leaving a wake of devastation through her family and the wider community. For Juel's extended family, the loss was unimaginable. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, their world was irrevocably altered. Imagine the phone calls, the hushed conversations, the raw disbelief as the news spread. A vibrant 3-year-old, gone. Not from illness, not from an accident, but from violence within her own home. During the trial, their grief was palpable. You could see it in their faces, etched with sorrow and anger. Perhaps they wore photos of Juel, small reminders of the life that was stolen. Maybe they spoke victim impact statements, their voices trembling as they tried to articulate the enormity of their loss, the gaping hole Juel's absence left in their family. They were the silent witnesses to the legal proceedings, their presence a constant reminder of who this was all for, the little girl who would never again laugh, play with dolls, or hug her loved ones. Their pain was a heavy presence in that courtroom, a testament to the enduring bonds of family and the agonizing impact of such a senseless tragedy. Juel Howard's story is a stark reminder, isn't it? A chilling example of how quickly and devastatingly things can go wrong when those entrusted with a child's care fail in their most basic duty, to protect. A vibrant little life, full of promise, extinguished by violence in the very place she should have been safest, her own home. It's a story that leaves us with a profound sense of sadness, but also a responsibility. A responsibility to learn from this tragedy, to be more vigilant, to be more aware. Because Juel's case isn't just an isolated incident, it's a heartbreaking illustration of a much larger issue: the vulnerability of children and the critical importance of child welfare. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the darkness that can exist behind closed doors and the devastating consequences of neglect and abuse. So, what can we take away from Juel's story? What can we do to honor her memory and prevent similar tragedies from happening again? Think about this. What are the signs of distress in a child that should absolutely never be ignored? Not just obvious injuries, but the subtle changes in behavior, the quiet cries for help that might be easily missed or dismissed. What are those red flags, and how can we become better at recognizing them, at taking them seriously? And beyond individual awareness, we need to consider the bigger picture. How can communities do a better job of supporting vulnerable families? What resources are needed? How can we create stronger safety nets for children at risk? These are difficult questions, but they are vital ones. Because the safety of our children is not just the responsibility of parents or social services, it's a community responsibility. If stories like Juel's resonate with you, if you believe in the importance of understanding true crime cases and using those lessons to make a difference, then please consider subscribing to this channel. We bring more difficult stories not for sensationalism, but to learn, to reflect, and to contribute to a safer world. Join the conversation. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's work together to ensure that Juel's story and the stories of other victims serve as a catalyst for change, a call to action to protect the most innocent among us.